Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Picture an angel. You're probably thinking of a glowing figure with magnificent feathered wings, or, well, if you have been on the internet lately, a terrifying spinning wheel of eyeballs that looks like it belongs in a cosmic horror movie. Today, we are dismantling the viral meme of biblically accurate angels. We are going to reveal that the earliest, original biblical messengers were actually completely indistinguishable from average, everyday humans. And together, we are going to trace the fascinating historical mystery of how ancient Near Eastern sphinxes, winged serpents, and supernatural chariot wheels were eventually mashed together into a giant, complicated cosmic family tree by writers centuries later.
Yeah, the evolution of the angel is, it's essentially a massive centuries-long game of historical telephone. Tracing this back to the oldest original texts really reveals the mechanics of how human imagination, political trauma, and cultural blending completely reshape the things we consider to be, absolute religious facts.
Definitely. And before we jump into the deep end of that history, a quick word to you listening. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. We have a massive stack of source material to unpack in today's deep dive, from ancient manuscripts to regional Iron Age iconography. The goal is to make sense of all this evolution without making your head spin. So, to build our foundation, we have to look at the word itself.
Right. The word itself is the skeleton key to this entire mystery. So the English word angel originates from the Greek word angelos, which was actually used as a direct translation for the Hebrew word malach.
Okay, malach.
Yeah, and both of those ancient words literally just mean messenger. It's a job title. It is an occupation, not a biological species.
Wait, if it's just a job title, does that mean a human carrying a letter could technically be an angelos? How did a word for, a postal worker turn into a celestial being?
Well, the ancient texts actually applied the word to both human beings and divine beings indiscriminately. If you read ancient Greek literature, like Homer's Iliad, the human messengers running across the battlefield to deliver news to Achilles, they're called angelos.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Yeah, and even in the historical texts of the New Testament, like the Gospel of Luke, John the Baptist is explicitly referred to as an angelos.
Really? John the Baptist?
Exactly. He certainly was not a divine glowing entity floating down from the clouds. He was a mortal man carrying a prophetic message. The translators use the exact same vocabulary for human couriers and divine couriers.
I am already struggling to reconcile this with the Renaissance paintings of winged babies or even, the intense stained glass windows you see everywhere.
Not completely. It's a huge shift in perspective.
Right. If these divine messengers look exactly like mortal couriers, the actual Hebrew Bible reads less like a high fantasy epic and more like an undercover spy novel. It just seems absurd to me that a truly original, quote-unquote, biblically accurate angel is actually just a totally forgettable, generic guy you would pass on the street.
But that is exactly what they were. When we isolate just the earliest layers of the Hebrew Bible, stripping away centuries of later theology, these messengers simply appear as normal men.
No wings at all.
No wings. There are no halos. They do not possess extra limbs or multiple eyes. They are physical, ordinary-looking male humans.
But if they look completely normal, how do people in these stories know they're talking to a divine being? I always picture someone dropping to their knees because of a booming voice and blinding light.
Right, the cinematic approach.
Exactly. But from the source material you pulled for this deep dive, people seem entirely oblivious to who they are talking to.
They really do, and that subtlety is what makes these early texts so fascinating. Look at the book of Judges, specifically chapter 13. A divine messenger appears to a woman who will eventually be the mother of Samson to prophesy his birth.
Okay. And how does she react?
Well, she reports back to her husband, Manoah, and says she saw a man of God, noting that his appearance was awe-inspiring, like an angel of God. She picks up on a specific gravity or presence.
So she knows something is up.
She senses something unusual, yeah, but she still physically perceives him as a human man.
And then her husband, Manoah, just completely misses the memo, right? He doesn't pick up on that gravity at all.
Noah has absolutely no idea. He goes outside to speak with this stranger, and the ancient cultural laws of hospitality just kick in. He is so clueless about the stranger's true identity that he insists the man stay and share a meal of young goat.
You're kidding. He tries to feed him a goat.
Yeah. The text goes out of its way to explicitly state that Manoah did not know he was interacting with the messenger of the Lord.
So he is just trying to be a good host to a weary traveler, and then what happens? How does the disguise finally drop?
Well, Manoah prepares a sacrifice on a rock, And as the flames leap up toward the sky, this perfectly normal-looking traveler suddenly ascends into the heavens within the column of fire.
No.
Yeah, that is the exact moment Manoah realizes his massive mistake and falls on his face in terror.
I mean, a flaming jetpack exit will certainly clear up any confusion, but this undercover aspect shows up again in Genesis 19, right? With Lot in the city of Sodom.
Yes, exactly.
Mm.
2 messengers arrive in Sodom in the evening. Lot is sitting at the city gate. And for reasons the text leaves slightly ambiguous, Lot recognizes their supreme importance immediately and bows with his face to the ground, offering them shelter.
Okay, so Lot figures it out, but what about the rest of the city?
The broader population of Sodom. The regular townspeople perceive them as nothing more than ordinary, vulnerable, mortal men visiting from out of town. There is absolutely no celestial glow tipping off the crowd.
I want to push back a little here, though, because we shouldn't give the impression that these undercover messengers are harmless just because they look normal.
Oh, absolutely not harmless.
Right. Even if they look like your neighbor, the source material shows they are carrying a terrifying amount of power. It is like having a nuclear bomb hidden inside a completely ordinary-looking leather briefcase.
That is a great analogy. The contrast between their mundane appearance and their capacity for mass destruction is staggering. In the historical accounts of 2 Kings 19, a single messenger is deployed to the camp of the Assyrian army and strikes dead 185,000 troops in a single night.
185,000, just one guy did that.
Just one. And in 2 Samuel 24, a messenger of destruction spreads an epidemic through the land that kills 70,000 Israelites. The devastation only halts when the entity reaches the threshing floor just outside Jerusalem, and God explicitly intervenes, saying, "It is enough, stay your hand."
So they're walking weapons of mass destruction, but they still look like average guys. Although, looking at the later texts in the outline, there is at least one instance where a messenger looks significantly more intense than a standard mortal.
Ah, yes. You are looking at the book of Daniel, which represents a slightly later textual tradition. Daniel receives a vision of a terrifying celestial messenger. Many scholars identify him as Gabriel.
Right, and how is he described?
This entity is clothed in linen, but its body gleams like the gemstone beryl, his face flashes like lightning, his eyes are like flaming torches, and his arms and legs shine like burnished bronze.
Okay, that is undeniably intense, but the crucial distinction here is that he still possesses a human shape, right?
Exactly. He has a distinct face, 2 eyes, arms, legs, and a torso. He is fundamentally humanoid.
It makes perfect sense why, in the New Testament, the very first thing Gabriel has to say to people like Mary is, "Do not be afraid."
Right, because an intimidating, lightning-faced man suddenly materializing in your living room is terrifying. But he is still a man.
Yeah, throughout the later Gospels, they are depicted as powerful agents of the end times, tasked with separating the righteous from the wicked. But through all of these descriptions, from the undercover travelers to the glowing humanoid in Daniel, there is absolutely nothing to suggest they are giant floating wheels covered in eyes or multi-headed animal hybrids.
Right, nothing at all like that.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room, or I suppose the Sphinx in the room. If angels were originally just humanoid undercover messengers, well, where did the internet memes come from?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Like, where did modern artists get the inspiration for the giant interlocking rings and the 6-winged eyeball monsters? Did they just invent this imagery to make edgy digital art?
No, they are actually pulling directly from the biblical text, but they are making a massive categorical error. They are referencing highly bizarre, surreal visions of heavenly beings.
Okay.
But the major twist of this deep dive is this. In the original texts of early Israelite history, those bizarre, terrifying hybrid creatures were never, ever called angels.
Wait, so the very things the internet confidently labels biblically accurate angels aren't actually angels at all?
Technically and historically, no, they aren't.
That is wild.
The ancient texts describe 3 very distinct heavenly hybrid creatures, the cherubim, the seraphim, and the Ophanim. They occupied completely different roles in the cosmic ecosystem. We can start with the cherubim, which are mentioned roughly 90 times in the Hebrew Bible.
I think the moment most people hear the word cherub, they immediately picture the cute, chubby babies playing harps on Valentine's Day cards.
Oh, yeah. But that Renaissance depiction is the furthest thing from the ancient reality. In the descriptions of the inner sanctuary of the Temple of Solomon, the cherubim were not babies.
What were they?
They were massive, imposing wooden statues standing 15 feet tall, overlaid entirely with gold. They functioned as fierce guardians of the Ark of the Covenant and the throne of God. And according to the first book of Kings, they explicitly had exactly 2 wings.
So they were monumental guardian statues. Why did the ancient Israelites conceptualize their divine throne room with giant winged statues?
To understand that, you have to look at the geopolitical reality of the Iron Age Levant. The early Israelites were surrounded by massive superpower empires, particularly the Neo-Assyrians and the Babylonians.
Right.
If you look at ancient Mesopotamian palaces, the throne rooms were flanked by lamassu.
Oh, right. The lamassu are those incredible stone statues of winged bulls or lions with human heads, right?
Precisely. The lamassu were imposing hybrid sphinx-like creatures meant to project royal power and offer magical protection.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Yeah, the early Israelites lived in that same cultural context. When they imagined the throne room of the ultimate king of the universe, they naturally populated it with their own version of these hybrid divine bodyguards. The original cherubim were essentially Israelite lamassu.
But wait, the meme versions of cherubim don't look like 2-winged lions. The internet artists always draw them with 4 different animal faces on one head.
And that is where the cherry-picking of texts happens. Modern artists ignore the 15-foot golden guardians of Solomon's temple and focus exclusively on one highly specific, surreal vision experienced by the prophet Ezekiel.
What happens in Ezekiel's vision?
In his vision, the cherubim suddenly morph. They now have 4 wings instead of 2, and they possess 4 distinct faces: a human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle.
Why such a drastic change? How do you get from a standard Mesopotamian winged lion to a 4-faced chimera?
The mechanism behind that change is profound trauma and displacement. Ezekiel was a priest, but he was living during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE.
Okay, so they've been conquered.
Yes. The Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem and the physical temple. Ezekiel was living in exile near the Kibar River in Babylon, surrounded by bizarre, complex Babylonian composite art and architecture. His visions reflect a mind trying to process the majesty of God while immersed in the visual language of a foreign empire.
Wow, so his environment literally rewrote his imagination of the divine.
That is fascinating. Okay, what about the Seraphim? Because they sound like something straight out of a high fantasy novel.
The Seraphim are much rarer. They appear only 7 times in the Hebrew Bible, most famously in the vision of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 6. Isaiah sees the throne room of God, and the seraphim are stationed above the throne in attendance.
And what do these attendants look like?
Isaiah describes them as having 6 wings. 2 wings cover their faces, 2 wings cover their feet, which many scholars believe is a euphemism for their lower bodies, and they use the remaining 2 wings to fly.
Okay, so they're mostly wings.
Yeah. But we also know they have humanoid appendages, because the text specifically describes a seraph using its hand to take a burning piece of charcoal from an altar with a pair of tongs and pressing it directly against Isaiah's lips to purify him. Ouch. Having a burning coal pressed to your face sounds incredibly painful. It really highlights how the ancient concept of holiness was dangerous, not comforting. But there is a linguistic twist with the seraphim, too, isn't there? Why are they called that?
There is. The Hebrew noun seraph literally translates to burning ones. But the mechanism of how that word was used elsewhere in the region is revealing. That exact same word is used in other passages to describe venomous winged snakes in the desert.
Wait, winged snakes?
Yes. We find abundant evidence of winged serpents in Iron Age iconography from the region, heavily influenced by the Egyptian uraeus, the rearing cobra symbol worn by pharaohs to spit fire at enemies.
Flaming, 6-winged, venomous snake beings acting as divine throne attendants. The ancient imagination was wild. But we still haven't hit the weirdest entity on the list, the ones that are literally just flying geometry.
The Ophanim.
The Ophanim, yeah. The Hebrew word simply means wheels. These are the source of the nightmare eye wheel creatures from the internet memes, and they originate from that exact same exile vision of Ezekiel. So, Ezekiel, traumatized in Babylon, seeing 4-faced cherubim, and now wheel.
Yes. Beside the cherubim, Ezekiel sees entities that look like a glowing wheel intersecting perpendicularly within another wheel. And the rims of these colossal structures are entirely covered in eyes.
Covered in eyes, looking in every direction simultaneously. What is their function? Are they delivering messages?
Not at all. The Ophanim are not messengers. The scholarly consensus is that they are quite literally the wheels of God's divine heavenly throne chariot, known as the Merkabah.
So God's throne room is essentially retrofitted with all-terrain supernatural hubcaps because his people are on the move.
That is exactly the theological mechanism at play. Remember, Ezekiel is in exile. The permanent temple in Jerusalem is a smoking ruin. The Israelites are grappling with a terrifying question. Is God stuck in the ruins of Jerusalem, or can he reach us here in Babylon?
Wow, okay.
Ezekiel's vision of the Ophanim provides the answer. God's throne is mobile, it has wheels, it can travel anywhere.
That context changes everything. It turns a bizarre acid trip vision into a deeply meaningful theological survival mechanism. The cherubim are Sphinx guardians, the seraphim are burning throne attendants, and the Ophanim are the living mechanics of a divine vehicle. None of them are messengers, none of them are Malak.
Exactly. But this brings us to the core mystery. How did we get from these distinct, highly specific cosmic entities to the modern assumption that they are all just different flavors of angels?
It reminds me of a massive corporate merger. You have all these ancient writers looking at totally unrelated texts, different regional visions, and distinct mythological functions, and suddenly management decides, well, we need to streamline the org chart. You all work in the same unified cinematic universe now.
That corporate merger analogy is perfectly accurate. The mechanism that triggered this great cosmic retcon was, once again, exile and imperial influence.
More empires.
Right. After the Babylonian exile, the region was eventually conquered by the Persian Empire between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. The Persians had a massive, highly structured bureaucracy and a religion, Zoroastrianism, that featured a complex hierarchy of spiritual beings.
So as the Israelites are living under this vast Persian bureaucracy, they start projecting that same middle management structure onto their own heavens.
Precisely. The heavenly realm needed to reflect the complexity of the world they were living in. In later, post-exilic texts like the Book of Daniel, the Book of Tobit, and the Book of Enoch, we see this new taxonomy emerge.
How so?
Well, Daniel is the first biblical text to actually give these messengers names, Michael and Gabriel. And Daniel refers to them as princes, which suddenly introduces ranks.
Ah, so they are establishing middle management.
Exactly. Then the Book of Tobit introduces the angel Raphael, who declares he is one of the 7 angels who stand ready before the Lord. The Book of Enoch explicitly lists these 7 high-ranking entities. When these texts were translated to Greek, they coined the term Archangel, which literally means chief angel.
And what happens to our bizarre friends, the Cherubim, Seraphim, and Ophanim, during this corporate restructuring?
According to scholars of early Judaism, this is the exact period when writers started looking at those older, distinct throne creatures and lumping them into this new angelic hierarchy. The original nuances just sort of faded from cultural memory, and they became viewed simply as different species within the angelic genus.
And once that door was opened, later writers just kept expanding the employee handbook, right?
The theological fan fiction escalated for centuries. In the 5th or 6th century CE, an influential Christian text called On the Celestial Hierarchy created a rigid 9-tier ranking system.
9 tiers.
Yeah. The author argued that since the Seraphim and Cherubim physically encircle the throne of God in the old texts, they must be the executives. He put the 6-winged Seraphim in the highest C-suite rank, Cherubim second, and demoted the generic human-looking angels, the ones who actually interact with humanity, to the absolute bottom of the mailroom.
But that wasn't a universally accepted system, was it? People were just creating their own internal logic. A few centuries later, didn't the medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides completely reorganize the company?
He did. Maimonides established his own 10-rank system. He placed Ezekiel's living creatures at the very top, the Ophanim, the wheels, in 2nd place, and he demoted the cherubim all the way down to the 9th tier. It was entirely subjective, based on how each philosopher interpreted the ancient metaphors.
So when a modern internet artist draws a flaming whale covered in eyes, slaps a halo on it, and confidently labels it a biblically accurate angel, well, it is only accurate if you accept the retcon.
Exactly.
It is only accurate if you validate centuries of writers retroactively organizing older texts into a unified fandom wiki. If we look strictly at the oldest origins, a truly accurate biblical angel is just the generic guy sitting next to you on the bus.
Yeah, the human imagination constantly seeks to categorize and domesticate the unknown.
Reviewing the research notes for this deep dive, there was one detail about the average person's relationship with these entities that totally reframed my understanding.
Oh, the magic amulets.
Yes. We've talked extensively about how elite theologians evolved their definitions, but the common people in the ancient Near East had a much more practical approach. They didn't just pray for kindly guardian angels, they used aggressive ancient magic.
The archaeological evidence for this is staggering. We find ancient incantation bowls and magical amulets inscribed with spells invoking the names of these newly minted archangels like Michael and Gabriel. The mechanism here wasn't passive prayer, it was compulsion.
That is the part that fascinates me. They were writing legalistic, magical contracts to force these spiritual entities to protect them from demons or heal illnesses. It wasn't about seeking spiritual guidance at all, it was about binding power.
It reveals a worldview where humans felt they could actively negotiate with, and even command, the heavenly bureaucracy.
Mhm.
You used a spell to force the middle management angels to do their jobs and protect your household?
We have thoroughly sanitized that relationship today. I mean, we swapped out forceful magical incantations for comforting statues of fat babies with wings.
We really did. And tracing that entire evolution leaves us with a critical, provocative question to ponder long after this conversation ends. Knowledge, history, and definitions are never static.
Right.
If the very concept of an angel, something so universally recognized in modern art, religion, and pop culture, is actually a historical composite, a mashup of Mesopotamian Sphinxes, Egyptian winged serpents, the geopolitical trauma of the Babylonian exile, and centuries of post-exilic corporate categorization, well, what else in our lives fits that description?
That is heavy. It forces you to realize how much of what we accept as base reality is actually constructed over time.
Exactly. How many of our deeply held modern assumptions, cultural stereotypes, or historical facts are simply the result of centuries of people trying to organize ancient, blurry metaphors? What else in our collective cultural consciousness has been completely transformed by history's game of telephone?
It really makes you rethink every neatly categorized org chart in your head. The reality of history is always a murky, evolving landscape of human imagination and survival. So next time you are passing someone on the street who looks like the most average, generic mortal possible, maybe think twice before you offer them a goat dinner. You never know when they might launch into the stratosphere in a pillar of fire.